So what I want to talk about today is different things to do with water management. I was actually thinking about titling this video "Water Woes" because it's kind of a bunch of reflections on some of the more stressful aspects of managing plants that I have found over the past several years as I've kind of gone on this journey of trying to learn how to be in relationship and take care of plants. Um, Managing water has been the most stressful thing for me. I think the biggest learning curve has been managing water, and there's a lot that I could say about this, and I'll start with kind of more of a bent towards compost systems. What you can see me doing here is I am soaking brown materials for a compost pile. You may have heard of this either from other videos of where I've talked about this or other people talking about this, but it can be very beneficial. I would say it's almost essential to pre-soak your brown materials before composting. So like wood chips, fall leaves, sawdust, straw, that sort of stuff. These materials are often dry the way that they come to us, and they can take a lot of time to soak up water, these materials. And so I've mixed up compost piles without pre-soaking, and what I find is that stuff just doesn't break down. It doesn't take on water, and it will break down eventually, but it takes a really long time to break down, and so it slows the microbial activity of the pile down significantly, and it's almost impossible to water it in place. You just kind of have to wait a really, really long time for it to break down and soak up water if you don't pre-soak, because you have that pile sitting there and you try to add water to it, and the water tends to just, like with wood chips, for example, the water tends to just run off. They're not good at soaking up water fast, especially when they're fresh. It's different if we're talking about aged wood chips versus fresh wood chips. Aged wood chips are much better at taking up water, but when they're fresh, especially, and these are these ones we're looking at here, these are about 6 months old, so they're not fresh, but they're not really aged. But if you soak them, they will take up some water. If you soak them for 24 or 48 hours, they'll take up some water. And it's something that I'm having to force myself to do more often. I pretty much try to do it all the time now, because like I said, I've had some bad experiences where I have mixed up piles without pre-soaking, and just like the wood chips just don't take on water, and I just feel like I never got the hydration right in some of these earlier piles that I made, and as a result, the decomposition just happened at a really slow rate, which is not the end of the world. I'm still glad that I made those piles, but I think I would have had a more pleasant time and had finished compost faster if I had soaked the material. And this is where it's good to have a lot of used bins around for the soaking process. You could also, as I said, aged wood chips, aged brown materials will take up more water. So if you don't have these bins but you have time, you could just really age your stuff before you mix it into a compost pile. That's another way to help wet these materials. What really sparked this for me was I'm trying to build out my worm operation, and I'm trying to feed these worms mostly leaf compost. I'm trying to feed them a mix of leaf compost and wood chips and finished thermophilic compost. I'm not trying to give them a whole lot of food scraps, because I'm trying to not encourage animals to get into my worm systems. I have other areas where I don't really care if animals get into the compost, but with the worms, I'm trying to keep the animals out and give them less smelly food. And I have all this I have all this leaf compost, and I tried making some basically some worm windrows, if you will, but I found that leaf compost was too dry, and no matter how much I watered it, it just wouldn't get moist enough for like the amount of moisture that the worms really want. And so I wound up shoveling all that material into these bins, and there's some wood chips mixed in here as well. It's not just pure leaf compost, and soaking them. And this has worked well for me. That pile is retaining a lot more moisture now. I will say, however, I meant to soak these for like 24, 48 hours, but then I got busy, and it wound up being like 4, maybe 5 days of soaking. And so by the time I came back to this, it stank. It was really smelly. There was mosquitoes everywhere. Definitely don't recommend soaking for that long if you can avoid it. It wasn't the end of the world, but 24 hours is plenty. 48 is probably the max that I would go under ideal situations for soaking your browns before a compost pile. And so now I think I'll probably transition here into talking more about plants and not compost. So another big learning curve for me has been, how much water do the plants need? And when I first got into plants, I was messing around with like house plants and stuff, and I was always overwatering these house plants in pots, and I killed a lot of things for sure that way. And I finally found the balance with indoor plants, I think, for the most part, of getting the right amount of moisture in the pot. It just took some trial and error and like experiencing, okay, I watered that one too much and it died. I didn't water this one enough, and it, just took some time and experience. But in the garden, it's a different beast, because the sun is hotter, the rains bring more, you don't control the rains or the sun. And what I'm working towards is dry farming. I'd like to be at a point where I'm only watering things at establishment, and then throughout the rest of the season, unless we're in a really excessive drought, I don't want to be watering. I'd like to be dry farming, just using the rain. And I think, I'm confident that that is possible in my climate. I know it is, but there's some things you have to do to prepare and plan for that to really be successful. And I want to talk about some of the nuances that I have learned. There's certainly strategies that I'm implementing that help you retain more water. Things like dense mulch and incorporating compost and organic matter into your soil and planting very densely. Not having any bare ground, lots of green plant cover, roots in the ground all the time. All these things help you conserve water. And so when you get rains or when you irrigate, that water will last longer in the profile. And those are all great things. But what I've noticed is with how hot it gets down here in the southeast, in North Carolina, that tends to not be enough. Really what the plants need in a dry farming situation is they need access to groundwater. They need access to moisture that is consistent in the soil profile, kind of regardless of what the rain is doing. And in my soils and in most garden soils and farm soils, there's a compaction layer somewhere. For me, there's compaction anywhere from 5 or 6 inches down. Some places it's more than a foot, depending on how much I've built up the garden beds. But I haven't come in and broken up this compaction layer. And if you don't do that, your plants are going to struggle in the heat without some form of irrigation. It doesn't matter how much mulch you have down. At least this has been my experience anyway, that if you don't break up the compaction, your plants the roots can't get down to the groundwater, right? And over time, roots and microbes together can break the compaction for you. You can, biology can break through it, but it's a lot faster and in some ways easier if you have fossil fuels and equipment to break that compaction layer up, with physical force. I haven't done that here because I don't have the equipment to do it, and so I'm kind of experimenting what's the longer, slower way to get there. But it's just something I think about a lot. I spend a lot of time irrigating, especially this year. I didn't really set up irrigation in these beds, so I spent a lot of time dragging hoses around and just leaving the hose on in certain spots and sprinkling in certain spots. I'd like to get some actual irrigation set up next year that's easier to operate, so that if there is a drought or if my plants are experiencing water stress, it's just easier to water. This year it's just I really didn't set it up well. But that's life, right? Like, it happens sometimes. I also kind of lost my pathways in here, because I planted dense, which is good, but I had these little itty bitty pathways, so getting access in there to water doesn't really work well. Anyway, that's just some reflections I've been thinking about in relation to water. Just some of the things I've learned over the past few seasons, that really managing water and giving water a lot of thought just makes the whole experience of growing plants and composting a lot more pleasant, and it takes time and experience to get it right, and it's always an iterative process. So yeah, water's important.